Welcome to Inside IR, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer that explores the latest developments in Australian industrial relations law and practice.
Hello and welcome to Inside IR, the Australian Industrial Relations podcast, the series that arms HR, IR and legal professionals with the latest industrial relations thinking. Today's podcast is also a bit of an inside safety. It's designed for those listeners who do tune into both, but the reason I'm up in Sydney today, I'm here with my fabulous partner, Nerida Jessup, who is joining me. My name is Natalie Gaspar. The reason we're both together is we're really keen to discuss a topic for episode 30 that has us sitting together and discussing these sorts of things in real life. We're going to be talking about the increasing pace of workplace change and how that impacts from both an industrial relations perspective, but increasingly from a regulator and safety perspective. So Nerida, welcome to Inside IR.
Thanks for having me.
So look, I don't know if it's just me as I get older, but the pace of change that we're seeing in corporate organisations feels like it is moving faster than it has before, certainly in my career. So if you think back even 5 years ago, the flexibility and the need for organisations to be nimble to respond to things in the market moves like ever before. So you have things from geopolitical trade wars, obviously the impact of the pandemic, headcount restructures, and we haven't even started to speak about the advent of artificial intelligence in businesses, but also just good old-fashioned mechanical automation continues to advance and evolve as well. So these are the sorts of things that human nature being what it is causes some discomfort and disruption, I suppose, to employees, and that's where unions get involved. So those of you will appreciate, even from reading mainstream media, how much activity there is at the moment in relation to things like workplace restructures. We are seeing that at, large Australian banks and across. It's effectively sector neutral, really, the impacts of that. But what we propose to do is go through from an industrial relations, a traditional industrial relations perspective, what all that means, Nerida. But I'm also really interested, and this is a word that we hear so much about, but what is psychosocial health and safety? I mean, can you even just give us an overview on that?
Yeah, psychosocial health and safety is a term which has emerged probably in the last decade or so. It really refers to non-physical risks, so risks to mental health from work. Under work health safety laws, which have been in Australian jurisdictions, so in the model jurisdictions for well over a decade now, there has always been an obligation to mitigate risk to health and safety, which has always included psychological risk. But there's been a number of reviews which have indicated that really the rates of mental ill health in the community, and particularly contributed to by work, have been on the increase at the same time that traumatic injury and death in Australian workplaces has been reducing. And so what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is a real effort from policymakers, lawmakers, to make work health safety laws do more in that space of protecting workers' mental health. So psychosocial health and safety really is just the concept which applies under work health safety laws, that employers have to take steps to protect workers from potential harm to their mental health in the same way that they do to physical health. So that's that concept.
And it's really interesting, that productivity imperative that you mentioned, the impact on our workers' compensation schemes in each state and territory. They're effectively going broke because of the impact of stress claims brought by workers. And it's that sort of general sort of high watermark of things. So the policy position is, well, let's stop that before we get to the stage instead of reactive, proactive. So all that thinking in relation to risk management and assessment is the focus of that. Now, what's that has translated to is probably a little bit of an increasing turf war between workplace regulators and unions, but who are often very active in this space. And I thought it would be helpful for those listening just to give a little bit of a lay of the land in what we see in the more traditional area of industrial relations in relation to workplace change. So not a new one, but exercising a right under a dispute settlement procedure to seek to either stymie or completely stop workplace changes, particularly with workforce restructuring and the like, often relying on the consultation clauses that exist in enterprise agreements. So it does pay heed to have a very close look at what the consultation obligations are that you've agreed to in your enterprise agreement, and be cognizant of when those consultation obligations engage. Is it as soon as a definite decision has been made, or have you agreed to an earlier trigger point where you need to engage with unions? And this is an important piece, because I'm interested, and I don't know if we've got data as to what is less stressful for employees, the spectre that there might be, for example, a workplace reduction or a need to upskill in a new skill, or perhaps de-skilling or move work locations, any of those sorts of things. Like, what does it mean to know that it might be happening, but I don't know if it's me, I don't know when, or, okay, this is happening, it's definitely happening, how can you influence that? So some of those interesting things, again, is the crossover for that. I'm just going to give a little shout out to insidious status quo type provisions in enterprise agreements. Now, those are often used by employees and sometimes erroneously understood by employers to effectively be a mini injunctive mechanism. And we've seen some decisions recently, including from the federal court, which just gives pause to be a bit more reflective, actually, as to how the status quo provisions engage. So that's your sort of traditional industrial relations lever, I suppose, to looking to involve in consultation. Now, that's also translating, unsurprisingly, to different demands at the bargaining table, of course, in relation to consultation and agreement by employees and unions. They're asking for more information up front before definite decisions are put in, but also looking to impose some guardrails or restrictions on the flexibility that we were describing at the start, that employers indeed need to be nimble in this modern world of doing business in this country. So concepts like prohibitions on involuntary redundancy, on, upskilling and how that's done and who it's paid for, and all these sorts of concepts. Prohibition on the use of AI, regulating and specifying working arrangements, including working from home or elsewhere. So that is all translating to the bargaining table. We see employee activism in concepts like even governance issues. So, Qantas, you look at the response to the ACCC issue in relation to ticketing and the outsourcing dispute, and that escalated to board level, at shareholder level. So a well-trodden path in my space, Nerida, but I'm really interested to hear your reflections on what it means, from a regulator perspective.
Yeah. There's a lot of common themes between issues which will be raised as an industrial issue or an industrial claim, and increasingly what we're seeing in the health and safety space. And that has been a trend for a long time. And I think some of the recent highly publicised interventions by safety regulators has really kind of drawn a line under some of those. So you will have seen in the tertiary sector recently, so at UTS, at Macquarie, at ANU, all of those universities have been undertaking transformation processes, not uncommon in the sector, and all of those universities have had intervention from safety regulators. UTS, for example, had a prohibition notice issued to it in respect of a workplace change, which it contended posed an imminent and serious risk to workers going through that change. And it had to take steps to sort out some of the issues which, particularly in relation to communications and consultations. I think one of the discussions that you have when you talk about how do you mitigate risk of workplace change and why is this such a key focus of safety regulators at the moment, I don't think you can ever de-risk change. Change is stressful, and particularly if workers are going to be impacted, their jobs are going to be impacted, potentially they'll be out of work. This is a stressful process.
So is the law trying to prohibit stress in the workplaces and stressful events, or is it process? Like, what are the hallmarks of good?
Yeah, so it is a process, and a lot of this can be done in the planning. Work health safety laws don't require businesses to eliminate risk. They require businesses really to look into the potential harm which can be caused by work. Workplace change is an obvious psychosocial hazard, is the language we use, and then go through a process of working out what they can do to reduce that harm as much as they can. It's a harm minimisation obligation, not a de-risking obligation. So probably for the last 5 years, it's not been uncommon for employers to start a workplace transformation process, receive a Section 155, a compulsory information notice from a regulator, requiring a copy of your risk assessment or your change impact assessment, a copy of evidence that you've complied with consultation obligations under workplace health and safety laws, and that you've actually considered the feedback and input from that, and you've got a communications plan in place. So that's it's not uncommon for safety regulators to look in on these processes. That has been a trend for a while. But these more serious interventions, actually pausing change processes, is a really quite a recent development.
And so what are some of the key, I suppose, hazards that practitioners and listeners need to be cognizant of when they are looking at a workforce transformation of any sort?
Yeah. So the key hazards is obviously stress arising from poor workplace change. Poor workplace change often goes to communications, messaging around the reasons for change, making sure that workers are involved in consultation, and that consultation is ongoing. And the consultation involves not just industrial issues, but how we're actually going to support workers through this, providing support and contact points through that. But also a key psychosocial hazard is the impact on workers who might be dealing with changed processes, changed systems, changed workloads. So it requires you really to kind of think through what is the impact on workers who will be affected and what can we do to support them, including through communications, and what about the workers whose roles will be changed, work demands will be changed, supervision arrangements will be changed.
So I guess, I'm thinking about the sorts of changes, at least certainly even in the way you and I work with our teams, and how that's changed even over the last 5 years. So some of them are more profound, the way we can work at home and, the advent of being contactable 24/7, all those sorts of things. I suppose what I'm saying is it's on a spectrum, right? Some of the more obvious things that you would look at doing a risk assessment for, being really curious and deliberate about job design and consultation and sort of having a multidisciplinary team within your organisation, is like your big spill and fill stuff, like where it's a whole of business, we are reducing headcount. And then you sort of go down what workplace change is, because it can be quite evolving, I suppose. So some of it might just be you've got co-piloting for the first time, and you're a worker who's not familiar with that technology and you need to upskill. Are you saying that a full, the IR person needs to go with the IT person and sit down with the WHS person and do a full risk assessment before that sort of technology? Like what does it look like? It
certainly does seem to be the direction of travel. And just to illustrate, in New South Wales, there's a bill before Parliament to amend our Work Health Safety Act to introduce a standalone duty of care in respect of the use of digital work systems. So that specifically, and digital work systems is broadly defined to include software, AI, any digital work,
those sorts of things.
So the expectation, and that duty of care will be introduced with access rights to information. So unions will be able to request access to examine records in relation to those digital work processes. The way to prepare for that is exactly as you've described, to assume that these types of decisions, these types of transformations and these types of changes will have human impacts. There is potential for harm, and if there is a complaint or a concern raised, to expect that there will be some level of investigation by a union, by a safety regulator, but relying on this concept of psychosocial health and safety.
So the point, it's an obvious one, but it's worth bearing, that at the workplace level, the person who wears that Dello hat is often the person who wears that same hat interchangeably, and can issue pins and involve with the regulator as well as the traditional, industrial relations from a Fair Work Commission type of perspective. So those listening, Nerida, what's the key message? Is it takes longer, you need more people? What do you say?
Yeah, I think the key message is to incorporate safety into the planning process. Consultation is now consultation in relation to safety. If you go through that process in the beginning and are prepared for concerns to be raised, are flexible and responsive to that, you should be able to continue your change processes with the flexibility that you need. Where employers come unstuck is where they are receiving notices, receiving knocks at the door from safety regulators, and they haven't been through that process. Yeah. You don't want to be going through this investigation in a responsive state. That is where change processes can be slowed down, like we've seen at UTS.
And I think, again, just to sort of round out by how we started, this happens so quickly. The workplace changes that organisations just need to be so nimble and move so quickly, the imperatives. And so it really pays, I think, to get a playbook developed, doesn't it? It sounds a bit trite, but there is something for just exercising that muscle so that you can organisationally move really quickly if you need to. I mean, again, thinking about all the sorts of changes that impact. Some you see coming, some there might be, natural disaster or, President Trump does something overnight that changes everything about the way an organisation operates. And so in order to move quickly, there is a bit of pause required, I think, and it is something about, speaking to your colleagues and how fantastic that we get to work together in this space to do those things. And I think just again from a pure industrial relations perspective, I think it is a worthwhile investment to be really deliberate and thoughtful in relation to, well, what is it that you're required to consult about under your enterprise agreement? What does your enterprise agreement constrain you from doing? What does it enable you from doing? And in particular in relation to those status quo type of provisions. So any other final reflections from your end, Nerida?
No, I think it's nice to get to work together on this. I think while it is, a bit of pain if you're getting a knock at the door from a regulator, it is actually an opportunity, I think, to formalise some of the things that you naturally do. Yeah. And you naturally would approach a change process with care, with thought. And some of this is about just systematising that and calling it, putting it through your risk management process.
And I think the sorts of things we're describing, I mean, speaking to your workers to understand what it means for them when they go home and what it means when they come to, that's just good business practice, isn't it? Because we haven't spoken about just the reality of the human impact on these sorts of things. And good employers want to do that in a way that enables them to do business and do so nimbly, but in a way that genuinely respects and hears their workforce. So if you think about it in that lens and get ready and have genuine sort of discussions and being thoughtful about those things, recognising that people are different. We've got this multi-generational workforce issues where some people love these sorts of changes and others are a bit more resistant. So, well, thank you, Nerida, for joining us on Inside IR. You will see Nerida regularly on Inside Safety, our parallel podcast. As always, thank you for listening in. We love your feedback. So if you do have any, please do reach out at insideir@hsfcramer.com. Reach out to any of your partner contacts and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.